The first flaw to mention is that the Sec Ops are involved in a long-term engagement on a foreign planet. The Sec Ops are playing an away game. Pandora is lush with exotic forests and terrain more than a bit unknown to human beings. They don't have knowledge of the land or its ins and outs. And more importantly, they don't have a biological or symbiotic connection with the land like the enemy they're fighting. The next flaw to discuss is that the Sec Ops hate science. The security operations Marines are brave, but they're also single-minded in terms of their thinking. They only think in military terms and are hostile towards scientists like Dr. Grace Augustine. Had they listened to or consulted her, perhaps they could have learned more about Na'vi capabilities or about the terrain, including the threat of wildlife. And I get it, reading is for aliens, but if the Sec Ops wants to succeed, they're going to have to learn that science is valuable in the battle against the Na'vi. The next flaw of the Sec Ops is that they have a hot-headed leader. The Sec Ops' rejection of science is spearheaded by Colonel Quaritch, a bona fide badass and a man who puts duty above self-interest, and we will celebrate him in our next video. But he also is a bit of a loose cannon, willing to rush into battle without thinking or properly mapping his surroundings. Little time passed between his request to attack Hometree and the actual invasion. And when he gets angry, he seems to attack or shoot without thinking. That gets the Sec Ops in trouble. He isn't calm, cool, and collected during battle. And ultimately, his aggression and impatience prevents him from being able to regroup his men and replan during the battle for Hometree. The next flaw is that the Sec Ops main ships have no ejector seats. The AT-99 Scorpion gunship is a great aircraft in many ways, all of which we will discuss in the next video. But it has some flaws, and one of the major ones is that it has no ejector seat. Instead, inertial auto-rotation, or unpowered landing, is the preferred method of surviving a power-out scenario. But you'd think for an aircraft that was built for combat, its engineers would have foreseen that there would be instances where the ship cannot land without power because it has been hit with a missile and either is spiraling towards the ground or just explodes in the air. Watching Trudy sit helpless in her aircraft after it was disabled made her demise seem pointless. This is a force that has figured out how to colonize a planet over 4 light years from Earth and yet can't get pilots in damaged aircraft to the ground safely. Our next flaw is the wildlife on Pandora. While the Sec Ops have great tech, it doesn't seem great enough to overpower the wildlife on the planet they are active in occupying. One would think with their already long tenure on the planet, they would have developed tech that's prepared to deal with the animals on the planet, like the hammerhead titanotheres. We see that while the Na'vi are easily felled by Sec Ops firepower, the other wild creatures on Pandora are not. They compete with the best of Sec Ops tech and are ubiquitous on the planet. The next flaw is that the Sec Ops is a private military force. In many ways, this is an advantage, in others, not so much. The RDA is more powerful than any Earth government, and thus in a way is a government over humanity that doesn't bend to the will of humans. While this can be favorable, at the same time they don't necessarily work for humans either, and thus, if they were to find non-human customers that can pay, they could easily turn on humanity and carry out missions that are not in the best interest of Earth. The next flaw we have to discuss is body armor. We see this time and time again as a flaw with Space Marine groups. Crappy body armor. The primary weapon of the Na'vi seems to be the bow, so the Sec Ops armor should provide some protection against arrows, but it doesn't seem to do so at all. Now, the armor available to Sec Ops infantry in Avatar the game is an upgrade from the armor in the film, and we will discuss it in the next video. The next flaw is a lack of breathing technology. Now here you might say, but American Ben, Sec Ops has the Exopack, the lightweight atmosphere filtration system that allows humans to breathe on Pandora by filtering out the toxic elements in the atmosphere. But I see this as a serious disadvantage. The Exopack becomes a target for enemies as they can simply target the mask, and if successful in destroying or removing it, the human wearer will die. That's a pretty big weakness when up against creatures that can breathe on the planet naturally. The Colonial Marines, on the other hand, have atmosphere processing plants, or APPs, thanks to Weyland-Yutani, that can equalize the atmosphere for humans, or even potentially make it unsuitable for a planet's native inhabitants. Yes, the APPs take a long time to build and a constant crew to maintain, but for groups like the Colonial Marines or SecOps that are in the business of long-term colonization, they make a lot of sense. The exopack also only works on planets with the requisite oxygen in the atmosphere to support human life. It only filters out toxic elements, so it isn't a panacea for aiding in human colonization efforts universe-wide. Finally, our last flaw is oversight. As one commenter recently pointed out on a previous video in this series, one of the Colonial Marines' best advantages is that, quote, they know when to bug out and nuke the entire site from orbit. And of course, the Starship Troopers mobile infantry aren't afraid of nukes either, given that the United Citizen Federation employs the planet-breaking Q-bomb. But SecOps is not permitted to carry nukes or other weapons of mass destruction. The RDA does not roam free in space, period. They are still overseen by international treaties, the United Nations, and by the Interstellar Commerce Administration, an intergalactic regulatory body. Their power to use nuclear weapons or to proliferate other weapons arsenals is heavily restricted by these entities. It's hard to say whether the Weyland-Yutani Corporation from Aliens or the Resources Development Administration has more power, but certainly Weyland-Yutani operates with less accountability throughout space. Okay, maggots, it's time to vote. Rate SecOps on a scale of 1 to 5 in the top right corner of the video. My next video will be on the advantages of the SecOps. And finally, the wait is over. When you rise with the dawn of Monday, Alan will bring you Warhammer.